Before getting into today's stories, let me know where everyone is from and what time so we can send wishes of health and luck to you and your relatives and friends. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos of our channel. Thank you very much, everyone. Let's get started. Story 1. It happened when I was 22, during my final year of college. I had always been drawn to true crime documentaries and mystery novels. So when I spotted a flyer for a crime and justice seminar in the city, I knew I had to go. My best friend Emma came along and we made a day of it. The seminar was fascinating, with speakers ranging from ex-detectives to forensic psychologists. On the way back, we boarded a late-night train, tired but exhilarated. That's when I noticed him. He sat a few seats away, staring intently at the floor. His presence felt heavy. I thought I recognized him from a literature class, so I nudged Emma. "Do you know that guy?" I whispered. Emma glanced over and shook her head. "Nope, but he's cute if that's what you're thinking." Emboldened, I waved at him. To my surprise, he looked up, smiled faintly, and walked over. His name was Ryan, and yes, we'd had a class together. He seemed shy but polite. By the time we reached our stop, we'd exchanged numbers. A few days later, Ryan texted me. His message was short. "Want to grab coffee tomorrow?" He wasn't overly chatty, but I figured he was just reserved. We met at a small cafe near campus. Conversation was easy at first, but his gaze was unnerving. He rarely blinked, and he seemed to study me like a puzzle. So I asked, trying to break the tension, "What got you into true crime?" He leaned forward slightly, his voice quiet. "People fascinate me. Their secrets. What they hide behind smiles." I forced a chuckle. "Sounds intense." "It is," he said, tilting his head. "Don't you ever wonder what someone is capable of? What they might do if pushed far enough?" His words hung in the air. I sipped my coffee, unsure how to respond. "Not really," I lied. "I guess I like the mystery more than the reality." Ryan smiled faintly, but it didn't reach his eyes. Mystery is only fun when you're not part of it. Despite my unease, I saw him again. Emma hosted a small party at our apartment, and without telling me, she invited Ryan. When he showed up, I felt my stomach drop. "Hey," he said, holding a bottle of wine. "Hope it's okay I came." "Sure," I replied, forcing a smile. "Come in." The party was lively, but Ryan didn't mingle. He stuck close to me, his eyes scanning the room constantly. At one point, Emma whispered, "He's intense. You okay?" "Yeah," I replied, though I wasn't so sure. Later in the evening, when most of the guests had left, Ryan cornered me in the kitchen. "Do you trust people easily?" he asked abruptly. I blinked. "What?" "Trust," he repeated. "Do you think it's dangerous to trust someone you don't really know?" I laughed nervously. "I guess it depends on the person." His eyes locked on mine, and me. "Do you trust me?" I froze, unsure what to say. Before I could answer, he smiled and said, "You should be careful who you let in." Weeks later, Emma and I attended a house party at a mutual friend's place. It was packed with people, loud music, and the comforting buzz of chatter. Around 11 p.m., my phone buzzed. A message from Ryan. "I'm outside." I hadn't told him about the party, heart pounding. I went to the door. He stood there, hands in his pockets, a small smile on his face. "How did you know I was here?" I asked. He shrugged. "Lucky guess." I let him in, too surprised to protest. He didn't blend into the party at all. Instead, he wandered through the house, silently observing. At one point, I saw him standing in a hallway, staring at the family photos on the wall. It felt wrong, like he didn't belong. Around midnight, most people had left. A few of us were crashing in the living room, but Ryan hadn't left. He sat silently in a chair, his eyes flicking between us. I approached him cautiously. "Hey, Ryan, it's late," I said, trying to sound casual. "Maybe you should head home." He looked up at me, his expression unreadable. "Do you want me to leave?" The question caught me off guard. "Well, yeah, it's been a long night." He stood slowly, his movements deliberate. "You know you're too trusting. You shouldn't invite strangers into your life." I felt a chill. "You're not a stranger," I said weakly. Ryan smirked. "Am I not?" Before I could respond, he walked toward the door, then paused. "Good night," he said, and left without another word. That night, I couldn't sleep. Around 3 a.m., I heard footsteps in the hallway. My heart raced as the doorknob jiggled. Then came a soft knock. "Who is it?" I called, my voice shaking. No answer. I stayed frozen, clutching my phone. Minutes passed, and I finally heard retreating footsteps. But the unease lingered. The next morning, Ryan was gone. No one had seen him leave. I texted him, asking why he'd come to the party uninvited. His reply was chilling. "I just wanted to see you one last time." A few weeks later, a news alert popped up on my phone. Local man arrested in connection with multiple disappearances. My breath caught as I stared at the mugshot. Ryan's face stared back at me, cold and expressionless. I never told anyone, but I still wonder what would have happened if I'd opened that door. Story 2. It was about 6 years ago when I found myself in a tough spot during my final semester at university. My apartment lease ended unexpectedly, and I had just 2 days to find a new place. My desperate search led me to a modest-looking studio basement offered at an unbeatable price. The landlord, an older man with sunken eyes and a nervous demeanor, explained that the previous tenant had left abruptly, so the space was available immediately. The basement had an unusual layout: a small living area with an attached kitchen, a narrow hallway dimly lit by a single bulb, and a bedroom at the far end. The landlord mentioned that the bedroom had a bit of a history, but didn't elaborate. Feeling desperate, I signed the lease without hesitation. As I moved in, an unsettling feeling crept over me. The air in the basement felt damp and heavy, and a strange, musty odor lingered near the bedroom. Trying to shake it off, I unpacked and set up in the living area, avoiding the bedroom entirely. Something about the way the door to that room stood slightly ajar, almost as if beckoning me inside, made my stomach churn. That first night, I began to hear faint tapping sounds. Tap, tap, tap. At first, I thought it was just old pipes in the walls, but as I lay on the sofa bed in the living room, I realized the sound was coming from the hallway. "Hello," I called out softly, my voice barely audible over the hum of the mini-fridge. There was no response. The tapping stopped momentarily, only to start again, this time louder and more deliberate. The next day, I called my best friend Jake, who had a knack for turning anything creepy into a joke. "You're just psyching yourself out," he said with a laugh. "Basements make noises. Ghosts don't pay rent." His words gave me enough reassurance to stay another night. But on the second night, the tapping turned into whispers. At 3 a.m., I woke to the sound of faint murmurs, like a hushed conversation coming from behind the bedroom door. "Jake, if this is some kind of prank—" "It isn't funny," I muttered while grabbing my phone and creeping toward the hallway. The door to the bedroom was now wide open. The air inside was freezing. I flipped the light switch, but nothing happened. The shadows in the room seemed to shift and move as if alive. On the wall opposite the closet, faint scratches were etched into the plaster. They formed words I couldn't fully decipher, but the meaning was clear. Leave. The next morning, I confronted the landlord. "You didn't tell me about the bedroom. What happened in there?" He avoided my gaze and fidgeted with his hands. "Old houses creak," he said vaguely. "If you're uncomfortable, you can break the lease. No questions asked." His response sent chills down my spine. Why would he offer that so easily? A few nights later, Jake decided to crash at my place after a party. He laughed off my concerns until around midnight, when the whispers started again. "Okay, man, this isn't funny." "Who is back there?" Jake whispered, his confidence waning. We both stared at the dark hallway leading to the bedroom. The whispers grew louder and more frantic. Then suddenly the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. Panicked, we bolted to his car and spent the night at his place. The next morning I returned alone to pack my belongings. When I opened the bedroom door, I noticed something new. The scratches on the wall had changed, forming a single bone-chilling sentence. "You weren't supposed to stay." Years later, Jake sent me a text out of the blue. "Hey, was your old basement at 112 Pine Street?" "Yeah, why?" I replied, feeling a familiar sense of dread. He sent me a link to a local news archive. My breath caught as I read the headline, "Unsolved Case, Student Found Dead in Locked Basement Room." The article described how years before I moved in, a student had been found lifeless in that same bedroom closet. She had written something on the wall before her death, but authorities dismissed it as incoherent rambling. The article ended abruptly, with no conclusion. My skin prickled as the landlord's words echoed in my head. "You can break the lease. No questions asked." To this day, I can still hear the whispers when I think about that room. Did I leave just in time? Or did I narrowly escape what waited for me in the shadows? Story 3. I grew up in a house perched on Blackthorn Hill, a place that seemed to breathe secrets into the walls. My parents, ever the skeptics, dismissed every eerie occurrence with explanations of faulty wiring, shadows from the trees, or creaky old pipes. But deep down, even they must have felt it. The house wasn't ours alone. The basement had always unnerved me. It was darker than it should be, with cold air that seemed to coil around you like a snake. My older brother Isaac used to sleep down there, and he always made jokes about it. "That's where the monsters live," he teased, ruffling my hair. But when he moved out, I begged my parents to let me have the room. It was big, private, and felt like a step toward independence. I didn't realize I was stepping into something I couldn't escape. The first night in the basement, I felt it, like someone was watching me. I brushed it off as my imagination, but then came the sound. A faint laugh, high-pitched and melodic, drifting from the corner of the room. My heart stopped. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. The room was silent, but the chill lingered. The next day, Isaac called to check in. I told him about the laugh, expecting him to tease me, but he just laughed nervously. "So you've met the little girl," he said. "What little girl?" I asked, unease creeping into my voice. "Oh, she likes to laugh," he said lightly. But there was something in his tone, something he wasn't saying. "Isaac," I pressed, "are you joking? What do you mean, the little girl?" There was a pause. Then he said, "She's harmless. Just don't talk to her if she speaks to you." He laughed again, but it sounded forced. "I'm sure it's nothing. Just the house settling." That night, I had my friend Sophie over. We were sitting on the floor, laughing about something silly, when she excused herself to use the bathroom. I stayed in the room scrolling through my phone, when suddenly Sophie shouted, "Ha ha, very funny." I looked up, confused. "What?" I called back. She opened the bathroom door, her face pale. "I heard you laughing outside the door. Really creepy. By the way, how did you even get there so fast?" "I didn't," I said. "I've been sitting here the whole time." Her expression shifted from annoyed to uneasy. "Then who was it?" she whispered. Before I could answer, we both heard it. A giggle, faint and airy, coming from the direction of the closet. Sophie grabbed her bag and bolted, muttering something about a bad vibe. I tried to laugh it off, but that night I couldn't sleep. The following morning I called Isaac again. "Okay, this isn't funny anymore." Sophie heard her too. "What is going on?" Isaac sighed. "I didn't want to scare you," he began. "But when I lived in that room, I used to hear her laugh at night. Sometimes she'd whisper my name. I thought it was you sneaking downstairs to prank me." "I never did that," I said quickly, my pulse racing. There was a long silence. "Well," he said finally, "then I guess it really wasn't you." He paused again, then added, "She called herself Sarah." The name hit me like a punch to the gut. "What do you mean she called herself Sarah?" "Look," Isaac said, his voice low. "Dad told me not to tell you, but when we moved in, he heard from the neighbors about a girl who went missing. Sarah. She lived here before us. They found her shoes in the woods behind the house. Nothing else." I gripped the phone tightly, my hands shaking. "Isaac, this isn't funny. I'm not joking," he said, his voice trembling now. "She's harmless. Just don't make her mad." That night, I locked the closet door and left the lights on. But at 3 a.m., the lights flickered and went out. In the silence, I heard it again. The giggle. "Are you looking for me?" The voice was right next to my ear. I screamed and turned on my phone's flashlight. The closet door was wide open. The lock shattered. I stumbled back, whispering, "Leave me alone." The laughter turned into a low, raspy voice. "But I like you here." I ran upstairs, setting off the house alarm in my panic. My parents were furious until I told them what had happened. My mother's face went pale. "Isaac said the same thing," she whispered. The next day, Isaac called me again. "Did you hear her last night?" he asked. "Yes," I whispered, my throat dry. She laughed again. There was a long pause. Then, faintly through the phone, I heard it. The same laugh, high-pitched and cold. Isaac's voice came back, trembling. "She's not in the basement anymore. Is she?" The line went dead, and behind me in the darkened corner of the room, I heard a giggle. There was a pause. Then he said, "She is harmless. Just do not talk to her if she speaks to you." He laughed again, but it sounded forced. "I am sure it is nothing. Just the house settling." That night, I had my friend Sophie over. We were sitting on the floor, laughing about something silly, when she excused herself to use the bathroom. I stayed in the room, scrolling through my phone, when suddenly Sophie shouted, "Ha ha, very funny." I looked up, confused. "What?" I called back. She opened the bathroom door, her face pale. "I heard you laughing outside the door. Really creepy, by the way. How did you even get there so fast?" "I did not," I said. "I have been sitting here the whole time." Her expression shifted from annoyed to uneasy. "Then who was it?" she whispered. Before I could answer, we both heard it. A giggle, faint and airy, coming from the direction of the closet. Sophie grabbed her bag and bolted, muttering something about a bad vibe. I tried to laugh it off, but that night I could not sleep. The following morning, I called Isaac again. "Okay, this is not funny anymore." Sophie heard her too. "What is going on?" Isaac sighed. "I did not want to scare you," he began. "But when I lived in that room, I used to hear her laugh at night. Sometimes she would whisper my name. I thought it was you sneaking downstairs to prank me." "I never did that," I said quickly, my pulse racing. There was a long silence. "Well," he said finally, "then I guess it really was not you." He paused again, then added, "She called herself Sarah." The name hit me like a punch to the gut. "What do you mean? She called herself Sarah?" "Look," Isaac said, his voice low. "Dad told me not to tell you, but when we moved in, he heard from the neighbors about a girl who went missing. Sarah. She lived here before us. They found her shoes in the woods behind the house. Nothing else." I gripped the phone tightly, my hands shaking. "Isaac, this is not funny. I am not joking," he said, his voice trembling now. "She is harmless. Just do not make her mad." That night, I locked the closet door and left the lights on. But at 3 a.m, the lights flickered and went out. In the silence, I heard it again. The giggle. "Are you looking for me?" The voice was right next to my ear. I screamed and turned on my phone's flashlight. The closet door was wide open, the lock shattered. I stumbled back, whispering, "Leave me alone." The laughter turned into a low, raspy voice. "But I like you here." I ran upstairs, setting off the house alarm in my panic. My parents were furious until I told them what had happened. My mother's face went pale. "Isaac said the same thing," she whispered. The next day, Isaac called me again. "Did you hear her last night?" he asked. "Yes," I whispered, my throat dry. She laughed again. There was a long pause. Then, faintly through the phone, I heard it. The same laugh, high-pitched and cold. Isaac's voice came back, trembling. "She is not in the basement anymore, is she?" The line went dead, and behind me in the darkened corner of the room, I heard a giggle. Story 3. I grew up in a house perched on Blackthorn Hill, a place that seemed to breathe secrets into the walls. My parents, ever the skeptics, dismissed every eerie occurrence with explanations of faulty wiring, shadows from the trees, or creaky old pipes. But deep down, even they must have felt it. The house wasn't ours alone. The basement had always unnerved me. It was darker than it should be, with cold air that seemed to coil around you like a snake. My older brother Isaac used to sleep down there, and he always made jokes about it. "That's where the monsters live," he teased, ruffling my hair. But when he moved out, I begged my parents to let me have the room. It was big, private, and felt like a step toward independence. I didn't realize I was stepping into something I couldn't escape. The first night in the basement, I felt it, like someone was watching me. I brushed it off as my imagination, but then came the sound. A faint laugh, high-pitched and melodic, drifting from the corner of the room. My heart stopped. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. The room was silent, but the chill lingered. The next day, Isaac called to check in. I told him about the laugh, expecting him to tease me, but he just laughed nervously. "So you've met the little girl," he said. "What little girl?" I asked, unease creeping into my voice. "Oh, she likes to laugh," he said lightly. But there was something in his tone, something he wasn't saying. "Isaac," I pressed, "are you joking?" "What do you mean, the little girl?" There was a pause. Then he said, "She's harmless. Just don't talk to her if she speaks to you." He laughed again, but it sounded forced. "I'm sure it's nothing. Just the house settling." That night, I had my friend Sophie over. We were sitting on the floor, laughing about something silly, when she excused herself to use the bathroom. I stayed in the room, scrolling through my phone, when suddenly Sophie shouted, "Ha ha, very funny." I looked up, confused. "What?" I called back. She opened the bathroom door, her face pale. "I heard you laughing outside the door. Really creepy. By the way, how did you even get there so fast?" "I didn't," I said. I've been sitting here the whole time." Her expression shifted from annoyed to uneasy. "Then who was it?" she whispered. Before I could answer, we both heard it. A giggle, faint and airy, coming from the direction of the closet. Sophie grabbed her bag and bolted, muttering something about a bad vibe. I tried to laugh it off, but that night I couldn't sleep. The following morning I called Isaac again. "Okay, this isn't funny anymore." Sophie heard her too. "What is going on?" Isaac sighed. "I didn't want to scare you," he began. "But when I lived in that room, I used to hear her laugh at night. Sometimes she'd whisper my name. I thought it was you sneaking downstairs to prank me." "I never did that," I said quickly, my pulse racing. There was a long silence. "Well," he said finally, "then I guess it really wasn't you." He paused again, then added, "She called herself Sarah." The name hit me like a punch to the gut. "What do you mean she called herself Sarah?" "Look," Isaac said, his voice low. "Dad told me not to tell you, but when we moved in, he heard from the neighbors about a girl who went missing. Sarah. She lived here before us. They found her shoes in the woods behind the house. Nothing else." I gripped the phone tightly, my hands shaking. "Isaac, this isn't funny. I'm not joking," he said, his voice trembling now. "She's harmless. Just don't make her mad." That night, I locked the closet door and left the lights on. But at 3 a.m., the lights flickered and went out. In the silence, I heard it again. The giggle. "Are you looking for me?" The voice was right next to my ear. I screamed and turned on my phone's flashlight. The closet door was wide open. The lock shattered. I stumbled back, whispering, "Leave me alone." The laughter turned into a low, raspy voice. "But I like you here." I ran upstairs, setting off the house alarm in my panic. My parents were furious until I told them what had happened. My mother's face went pale. "Isaac said the same thing," she whispered. The next day, Isaac called me again. "Did you hear her last night?" he asked. "Yes," I whispered, my throat dry. She laughed again. There was a long pause. Then, faintly through the phone, I heard it. The same laugh, high-pitched and cold. Isaac's voice came back, trembling. "She's not in the basement anymore." "Is she?" The line went dead, and behind me in the darkened corner of the room, I heard a giggle. Story 4. When I was 13, after my parents divorced, my mom and I moved to a creaky old house on the outskirts of a dense forest. The house was cheap, and my mom called it a fresh start, though it felt anything but fresh. The walls smelled like mildew and the floors groaned with every step. The layout of the house was strange. My room was tucked into a corner at the end of a long, narrow hallway, while my mom's room was closer to the main living area. My room had a small barred window that faced the forest, and though I did not say it aloud, I hated it from the moment we moved in. Something about that room felt wrong. "Do you like your new room, Ella?" my mom asked with forced cheer as we unpacked. I hesitated, staring at the corner where the walls seemed to warp into shadow. "It is fine," I mumbled. The first few nights were uneventful, but on the third night I woke up to a sound, a soft whisper, almost like someone muttering right in my ear. "Ella, Ella." I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The sound seemed to drift in from the hallway, growing louder and more insistent. I bolted to my mom's room and shook her awake. "Mom, someone is in the house," I whispered urgently. She groaned, half asleep. "It is an old house, sweetheart. Probably just the pipes. Go back to bed." Reluctantly, I trudged back to my room. But as I passed the hallway, I swore I saw a dark figure standing at the edge of the shadows watching me. I darted into my room and slammed the door shut, pushing a chair under the doorknob for good measure. The next morning, I convinced my mom to let me sleep on the couch in the living room. "It is warmer out here," I lied. She seemed too preoccupied with work to question it. That night, as I curled up on the couch, the whispers returned. "Ella, come back." My heart pounded as I pulled the blanket over my head. But this time, there was movement, the soft padding of bare feet across the wooden floor. I peeked out from under the blanket and saw a figure standing near the kitchen, a tall, skeletal man with hollow eyes and a twisted grin. "Mom," I croaked, though I knew it was not her. The figure tilted its head as if amused, and whispered, "Why don't you go back to your room, Ella?" I screamed, and the lights in the living room flickered violently. My mom came rushing out of her bedroom, her face pale. "Ella, what is wrong?" "There is someone here," I pointed to the kitchen, but the figure was gone. She searched the house but found nothing. "It is just a bad dream," she said, though her voice wavered. Over the following weeks, the whispers became a nightly torment. I started seeing the figure more frequently, always lurking near my room or standing at the edge of the forest outside. It began whispering things I could not understand, its voice like a rusted blade scraping against stone. One night I mustered the courage to confront it. "What do you want?" I yelled, standing in the middle of the living room. The figure emerged from the shadows, its bony fingers dragging across the wall. "It is not me you should be afraid of," it hissed. "It is her." "What are you talking about?" I demanded, my voice shaking. It did not answer. Instead, it pointed toward my mom's room, then vanished. The next morning, I confronted my mom. "Do you hear it too?" "The whispers." Her face went pale. "You have heard them?" she asked, her voice barely audible. I nodded. "What is going on?" She hesitated, then said, "When we moved in, the landlord mentioned strange things. People leaving in the middle of the night, saying they saw someone watching them. I thought it was just superstitious nonsense." "Why didn't you tell me?" I yelled. "I didn't want to scare you," she said, tears welling in her eyes. That night, I refused to sleep. I sat in the living room with the lights on, clutching a flashlight and a kitchen knife. Around midnight, the whispers started again, louder than ever. This time, they were not calling my name. They were calling hers. "Maria, Maria, come to us." My mom bolted upright from her room, her eyes wide with terror. "They are here," she whispered. Before I could react, the figure appeared in the hallway, joined by others. Shadowy forms with glowing eyes, their hands reaching out toward her. "Ella, run!" my mom screamed as the shadows engulfed her. I ran out of the house and into the forest, never looking back. To this day, I do not know what happened to her. The police found no trace of her or the figures, and the house was abandoned soon after. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the whispers again, and they are calling my name. This summer, desperate for extra cash to pay off my mounting student loans, I took on some graveyard shifts at a local diner. The pay was better, but the hours left me constantly sleep-deprived. By the time I stumbled home each morning, I would collapse onto my bed in my basement studio, which was barely larger than a shoebox. The studio was not much, with its single window level with the sidewalk, but it was cheap and quiet. Usually, it started 2 weeks ago. I had just fallen asleep after my shift when a sharp sound jolted me awake. At first, I thought it was nothing, just a neighbor dropping something or maybe a stray cat outside. I rolled over and tried to ignore it, but then about 10 minutes later, it happened again, a soft, deliberate tapping at my window. Tock, tock, tock. I froze. My heart pounded as I stared at the shadows dancing on the wall opposite the window. Maybe it is just the wind, I told myself. Maybe it is nothing. But then it came again, more insistent this time. Tock, tock, tock. I sat up, clutching the blanket to my chest. The knocking stopped. For a moment, I thought it was over. But then came the sound that made my blood run cold. The slow, deliberate scraping of nails, or something sharp, dragging across the window screen. Screech! My breath caught. My window was partially open, just enough for someone to reach inside if they wanted. I cursed myself for forgetting to lock it after my cat had been sitting there earlier. Summoning every ounce of courage I had, I grabbed my phone and slipped out of bed, careful not to make any noise. As I fumbled to unlock the screen, I dropped it, and the sound of the thud echoed in the silence. The scraping stopped. "Who is there?" I whispered shakily, regretting it instantly. No answer, just silence. Then a voice, soft, low and chilling. "I know you are awake." Panic surged through me. "Leave me alone," I shouted, my voice trembling. Story 5. A soft chuckle followed. It was not coming from the window anymore. It was inside my room. "You sound scared," the voice murmured. "Why are you scared?" I whipped around. But the room was empty, yet the voice was there, clearer now, as though someone was standing inches from me. "Who are you?" I demanded, gripping my phone tightly. "What do you want?" The voice ignored my question. "You should not sleep with the window open. You never know who might come in." I clenched my fists, trying to steady my breathing. "Get out of here. I am calling the police." Silence, then the faint sound of the window creaking open further. "Do not move," the voice warned. "If you move, I will come closer." My body froze, paralyzed by the sinister calmness of their tone. "What do you want?" I whispered again, this time more desperate. "Just to see you," the voice replied. "You look so peaceful when you sleep." almost like you are pretending to be someone else. I could not take it anymore. Ignoring their threat, I turned toward the window and slammed it shut. My heart raced as I locked it and pulled the curtains closed, refusing to look outside. You should not have done that, the voice said softly. This time it sounded farther away, but the words carried a sharp edge. I grabbed the kitchen knife from my nightstand and held it tightly. If you come back, I swear, the voice cut me off with a laugh. Swear what you will hurt me? You are just as helpless as the others. What others? I demanded, stepping toward the window. What are you talking about for a moment? There was no response. Then the voice whispered, Ask your landlord. He knows. He always knows. The voice faded and the room fell silent again. But before I could breathe a sigh of relief, something slid under my door, a folded piece of paper. I unfolded it with trembling hands and read the words written in messy, jagged letters. Do not sleep tonight. The next morning I called my landlord. My voice shook as I recounted what had happened. This is not the first time someone has mentioned strange things, he admitted after a long pause. But do not worry about it. Just keep your window locked and you will be fine. Wait, I said, my stomach sinking. What do you mean, strange things? Did someone else report this? He hesitated. It is an old building. People get spooked. Nothing serious. Look, if it happens again, just call the police. His words offered no comfort. That night I stayed up, determined to confront whoever or whatever it was. I sat in the dark, knife in hand, waiting for the knocking to start. At exactly 3:30 a.m., it came. Tock. Tock, tock. I did not move. The knocking grew louder. Tock. Tock, tock. Then came the voice again, calm and taunting. Why do you not let me in? Do you not want to know who I am? I stood slowly, gripping the knife tighter. Show yourself, I yelled. Let me see your face. There was a long pause. Then the curtains rustled. I am already inside, the voice whispered, this time from behind me. I spun around, but the room was empty. My chest heaved as I stumbled toward the door. Just as I reached for the handle, another note slid underneath. This one was shorter, but the words hit me like a punch to the gut. You forgot to lock the door again. The doorknob rattled. Story 6. My wife and I were house hunting in a busy part of town when we came across a property that seemed almost perfect. It was slightly hidden from the main road, surrounded by tall trees with a large backyard and plenty of charm. The house itself, though older, had potential, or so we thought. The realtor greeted us with her usual enthusiasm, ushering us inside. She described it as having great bones, gesturing to the outdated wallpaper and creaky floors. We nodded politely, exchanging skeptical glances as we moved through the upstairs rooms. The kitchen, with its avocado green counters, was far from impressive, but we figured it could be renovated. She added with a cheerful tone that we should wait until we see the basement because it has so much space for storage. At the back of the kitchen, the basement door creaked ominously as we opened it. The stairs descended into darkness, and as I stepped onto the top step, I hesitated. A strange sensation washed over me. A heavy, suffocating feeling, like stepping into a room with no air. I asked my wife if she felt that. She nodded, her face pale. She muttered that something felt off. Her hand brushed mine as we descended, and I could feel her trembling. As we reached the bottom, the feeling grew worse. It was like walking through thick, invisible sludge, every step harder than the last. The air felt heavy, charged with something I couldn't name. The basement was expansive but dimly lit, the walls lined with crumbling concrete. My wife stopped abruptly and said she did not like it and wanted to go back upstairs. The realtor didn't seem to notice our unease. She pointed out the washer and dryer, a small bathroom, and a sliding door that led to the backyard. Then she stopped in front of a heavy metal door near the far wall. She mentioned that she was not sure what it was, running her fingers over the frame. She added that it was unusual and suggested we take a look. The door had multiple locks, large industrial-grade ones, and it took her some effort to open it. When she finally did, the smell hit me first, a faint metallic tang mixed with damp concrete. The room inside was small, no larger than 5 by 5 feet, with concrete walls, floor, and ceiling. 4 metal poles were positioned in each corner, scratched and worn, their paint peeling. The floor had a drain in the center, and the walls were covered in uneven patches, like someone had hastily filled in holes. I muttered, asking what the place was. My wife stayed in the doorway, clutching the frame tightly. She whispered that it felt wrong. The realtor speculated that it might be a safe room, but her voice lacked confidence. Or maybe a storm shelter. I ran my hand over the patch walls and froze. The texture was strange, rough with faint indentations. My stomach churned. I quietly said that these were not patches, they were scratches, like claw marks. My wife's breath hitched. She said she couldn't stay there and wanted to go upstairs. As she turned to leave, we all heard it. A low, guttural moan coming from somewhere deep in the basement. The sound was faint but unmistakable, like someone or something was in pain. The realtor tried to laugh it off, nervously saying it must be the wind. I wasn't so sure. The sound seemed to come from the concrete room itself. I stepped closer to the drain in the center of the floor, peering down. My wife snapped at me not to, her voice sharp with fear. She told me to get out of there immediately. I reluctantly stepped back, and we started up the stairs. As we reached the fourth step, the heavy basement door, which had been propped open with a doorstop, slammed shut with such force that the walls shook. The realtor gasped and stammered that it must have been the air kicking on. Sure, I said, though I didn't believe it. When we finally got outside, my wife refused to talk about what had happened. We sat in the car in silence for several minutes before I finally spoke. I asked if she felt it, the presence. She nodded slowly. She said it wasn't just a feeling, she saw it. I turned to her, confused. I asked what she meant. She explained that when we were in the basement, there was something behind me. It was huge, black, shadowy, and wrong. It was watching me. She said she didn't want to say anything because she was scared it would notice her too. A chill ran down my spine. I asked her why she didn't tell me. She shook her head, saying she just wanted to leave. That thing, whatever it was, felt evil. She thought it was going to hurt me. The realtor called the next day to follow up. She cheerfully asked what we thought of the house. I hesitated and asked about the basement. There was a long pause. She quickly said there was nothing to worry about and that the previous owners had unusual tastes. She assured me it was all cosmetic. I wasn't convinced. I asked her what kind of tastes. She hesitated again. She told me that if I was uncomfortable, she understood, but she added that the room had been sealed for a reason. She hung up before I could ask more. My wife and I never went back to that house, but sometimes, late at night, I think about the scratches on the walls and the shadows she saw. And I wonder what or who was kept in that room. Story 7. When my family moved into our new house, it seemed like a dream come true. It was an old, sprawling place with tall ceilings and creaky wooden floors. A bit of history, as my mom called it. But the basement was where things got strange. The basement was huge, practically a second house, and my parents decided I could set up my piano and make it my space. At first, I loved it. It was quiet and isolated, perfect for practicing, but the longer I spent down there, the more unsettling it became. Shadows flickered where they shouldn't, and the air felt thicker, heavier. One evening, I was practicing a particularly challenging piece, a dramatic classical melody. My fingers stumbled repeatedly over the same note, and after an hour, I slammed my hands on the keys in frustration. Stupid piano, I muttered, pacing the room. As I walked back toward the piano, a single loud note echoed through the basement, freezing me mid-step. It was the same note I had been struggling to hit. My breath caught in my throat. What was that? I scanned the room. It was just me, the piano and the dim, flickering light from the old basement bulb. My pulse thundered as I cautiously approached the keys. They were still. Silence was deafening. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaking. "Who is there?" No answer. Only the faint creak of the house settling. I bolted upstairs to tell my mom. She was sorting through a box of old photo albums in her room when I burst in. "Mom, you won't believe what just happened," I gasped. She looked up, concerned. "What is it?" "The piano," I said, breathless. It played a note by itself. And it wasn't random. It was the exact note I couldn't hit. Her expression darkened. "I heard it too," she said quietly. "When I was putting boxes in the basement last week, the piano played all on its own." "What did you mean?" My stomach turned. "Why didn't you tell me?" she sighed. "I didn't want to scare you. I thought maybe I was imagining it. But it wasn't just that. I've been feeling something down there." "Like what?" I pressed. She hesitated. "Like we're being watched." Later that week, my mom, who loved photography, decided to take pictures of the basement. Maybe I'll catch something, she said, half joking. I stayed upstairs, too spooked to join her. About an hour later, she came back up, her face pale. Look at this, she whispered, holding out her phone. The photos were mostly normal, just cluttered corners of the basement. But then she showed me a live photo. As the image played, I heard it. A deep, guttural voice, low and rumbling. They're watching, it said. The hairs on my arms stood on end. And this, she continued, swiping to the next photo. It showed 5 glowing orbs scattered across the room, each one faintly pulsating. Mom, I whispered, what is this? She shook her head. I don't know, but it feels deliberate. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the voice. They're watching. Who were they? And why were they in our house? The next day I worked up the courage to go back to the basement. The piano sat in its usual spot, innocent and silent. But something felt different. The air was colder, heavier. Shadows pooled in the corners of the room, darker than they should have been. I sat at the piano and pressed a key. The sound echoed, sharp and lonely. Then I felt it. A presence behind me, cold and unmoving. Who is there? I whispered, my voice trembling. No answer. But the silence wasn't empty. It felt alive, as if the room itself were holding its breath. That evening, I confronted my mom again. We need to do something, I insisted. This isn't normal. We've already saged the house, she said. Twice. Then why is it still happening? She sighed, running a hand through her hair. Maybe it's not the house. Maybe it's us. Her words sent a chill through me. What do you mean? She didn't answer. Instead, she pulled out an old photograph from one of her albums. It showed a group of people standing in front of what looked like our house, though the paint was peeling and the yard was overgrown. They used to call this place the waiting house, she said softly. What does that mean? She hesitated. Legend says people who stayed here too long would start to hear voices, see things. They said the house didn't want them to leave. Mom, why didn't you tell me this before? I didn't think it was real, she said, her voice trembling. Until now. That night as I lay in bed, I heard it again, the piano playing softly. But this time, it wasn't just one note. It was the melody I had been practicing, the same melody I could never seem to get right. I crept downstairs, my heart pounding. The basement door was open, though I was certain I had closed it earlier. As I descended the stairs, the music grew louder, more frantic. When I reached the bottom, the piano stopped abruptly, the final note hanging in the air. And then I saw them. Shadows. Dozens of them clustered around the piano, their forms barely human. They turned to face me, their empty eyes glowing faintly in the dark. They're watching, a voice whispered, echoing through the room. I ran upstairs, slamming the door behind me. But even now, I can't escape the feeling that they're still here, waiting. And sometimes, late at night, I still hear the piano playing. Story 8. Last February, my mom and I decided to check on our old cabin about an hour from our main house. It was a quiet, isolated place surrounded by thick woods, peaceful during summer, but eerily deserted in winter. The cabin had a few quirks, especially the basement. It was unfinished, dark, and always damp, with a low ceiling that made you crouch as you went down the narrow staircase. Mom joked it felt like a dungeon, but I never found it funny. The day we went, it was bitterly cold. Snow covered the ground and the cabin looked like it had been swallowed by the frost. As we unlocked the door, a blast of icy air greeted us. Why does it always feel colder inside than out? My mom muttered, rubbing her hands together. It has been empty for weeks, I replied. That basement probably turned into a freezer by now. After dropping our coats on the couch, we set out to do our usual tasks, turning on the water, checking for leaks, and emptying the dehumidifier in the basement. As I crouched to descend the stairs, I felt it, a strange sensation, like someone was watching me from the shadows below. Mom, can you grab the flashlight? I called up. Why, the light is working. Yeah, but it is still creepy down here, I muttered, my voice trailing off as I reached the bottom. The dehumidifier was almost empty. I frowned, staring at the dry basin. That is weird, I said as my mom joined me. It looks like it was emptied recently. Maybe your dad stopped by, she suggested, though her tone didn't sound convinced. She pulled out her phone and texted him. Nope, she said after a moment. He has not been here in weeks. We exchanged a glance but shrugged it off. It wasn't until later that things took a darker turn. We sat down to eat, the cabin finally warming up from the heater. The silence was broken only by the quiet hum of the TV. About 5 minutes into our meal, A loud bang echoed from the basement. It was sharp, sudden, and unmistakably deliberate. Mom froze mid-bite. "What was that?" she whispered. I swallowed hard, my eyes darting to the basement door. "Probably something fell," I said, though even I didn't believe it. And then we heard it, a low grunt, faint but distinctly human. "Is someone down there?" Mom's voice trembled. I grabbed a jacket and motioned for her to follow me. "Let's go." Now, as we moved toward the door, I glanced at the basement stairs. The light was still on, but the bottom was shrouded in shadows. I could feel the weight of something unseen lurking down there. My hand instinctively tightened around the kitchen knife I had grabbed on the way out. We stepped outside, the cold air biting against our skin. Mom dialed the police while I stood guard by the car, my eyes fixed on the cabin. "Did you see anything?" she asked after hanging up. I shook my head. "No, but it feels like someone is watching." The police arrived quickly, 4 cruisers and 5 officers. 2 of them entered the cabin while the others fanned out to check the perimeter. 10 tense minutes passed before the front door creaked open. My heart sank as I saw one of the officers leading a man out in handcuffs. He was short, with unkempt black hair and thick glasses that magnified his hollow, bloodshot eyes. He looked disheveled, his clothes stained and tattered. One of the officers carried a bag filled with what appeared to be his belongings, a tattered blanket, a few cans of food, and an old notebook. "He was in the basement," one officer explained, approaching us. "Back corner. He had a small mattress set up." As relieved as we were that he was caught, something about the situation felt off. After the officers left, we returned to the cabin to inspect the basement. The mattress was still there, tucked into the farthest, darkest corner. Nearby, a series of strange symbols were scratched into the walls, almost like a crude map or a message. "What is this?" I whispered, tracing the marks with my flashlight. "I don't know," Mom replied, her voice shaking. "But I don't think it is just random." The unease deepened when we found the notebook. Flipping through its pages, we discovered crude drawings of the cabin's layout, but with details that didn't make sense. Hidden doors, tunnels, and symbols we couldn't understand. At the back of the book was a single phrase written over and over again. "I am not alone. I am never alone." That night I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind outside felt like a threat. I couldn't stop thinking about the man, why he had been there, why he chose the basement over the warm beds upstairs. Then just as I was starting to drift off, I heard it. A low, guttural grunt coming from the basement. I froze, my heart pounding. "Mom," I whispered, but there was no answer. The sound came again, louder this time. Slowly, I crept toward the basement door, knife in hand. As I opened it, a blast of cold air hit me. The light at the bottom of the stairs flickered and went out. And then I heard it, a faint whisper from the darkness below. "You should not have come back." Storyni. It was a gray, overcast afternoon when I wandered into a small antique shop in a quiet Midwest town. The shop was tucked between 2 old brick buildings, its faded sign barely legible, "Timeless Treasures." I had been here a few times before, lured by the scent of aged wood and dusty nostalgia. Inside, the store was a labyrinth of narrow aisles and mismatched booths filled with forgotten trinkets, old clocks, tarnished silverware, and sepia-toned photographs of long-departed strangers. The kind of place where time felt like it had stopped. The store was oddly quiet when I entered. No customers, no sign of the shopkeeper. A faint hum of white noise came from a small TV tucked into a corner, playing some grainy black and white film on a VHS tape. I shrugged it off and made my way toward the back, weaving through the cluttered aisles. At the far end of the store, a narrow staircase led to the basement. I hesitated for a moment, the air around the staircase feeling noticeably cooler, but curiosity pulled me forward. The steps creaked under my weight as I descended into the dimly lit basement. The basement was even more cramped than the first floor, with booths pressed close together and shelves overflowing with knickknacks. As I wandered, the faint sound of the TV upstairs followed me, a comforting hum in the otherwise silent space. Then I heard her, a woman's voice sharp and distressed, cutting through the static of the TV. "Why can't you understand? I can't go on like this." I froze mid-step, straining to locate the source of the voice. It sounded close, just a few booths ahead to my left. "Why do I deserve this?" Her voice cracked, raw and manic. The hairs on my arms stood up. She sounded desperate, broken, like someone on the verge of collapse. I swallowed hard, debating whether to keep going or turn back. But curiosity got the better of me. I stepped forward cautiously, expecting to find her sitting in one of the booths, perhaps on the phone or arguing with someone out of sight. "Hello," I called softly, my voice barely above a whisper. The only response was the faint hum of the TV. I turned the corner and found nothing. The booth was empty, save for a few dusty porcelain dolls and an old rotary phone. The voice was gone, the silence almost deafening. My chest tightened as I tried to make sense of it. I took another step, and suddenly the air changed. It was colder, sharp, biting, like standing in front of an open freezer. My breath hitched as a chill ran down my spine. It wasn't just cold, it was wrong, like the air itself didn't belong there. That's when I noticed the smell. Faint but distinct, a mix of lavender and something metallic, like old blood. I turned to leave, my heart racing, but as I moved back toward the stairs, the voice returned. This time, it was quieter, almost a whisper, but it echoed in my ears like it was right beside me. "Help me." I whipped around, my eyes darting between the booths. There was no one there. "Who is there?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. No answer. I took a shaky step forward, scanning the shadows. The whisper came again, closer now. "Please don't leave me here." My blood ran cold. The voice was coming from the rotary phone in the booth, the one I had passed earlier. It hadn't rung, but the receiver was now off the hook, dangling slightly. Against my better judgment, I approached the phone. The whispering continued, faint and frantic. I picked up the receiver, my hands trembling. "Hello," I croaked. The line crackled with static, and then a voice, soft, trembling, and unmistakably the same woman, spoke. "They won't let me leave." "Who?" I asked, my voice barely audible. The static grew louder, drowning out her words. But I caught one last fragment before the line went dead. "Look behind you." I dropped the receiver and spun around, but there was nothing there. Just the dimly lit basement and rows of silent booths. My breathing was ragged as I stumbled toward the stairs. When I reached the top, the shopkeeper appeared out of nowhere, startling me. "You okay?" she asked, her brow furrowed. There's something down there," I stammered. Her expression shifted, a flicker of unease crossing her face. "You heard her, didn't you?" I blinked. "You know about this," she sighed, leaning on the counter. "You're not the first. People say they hear a woman crying or talking to someone, always in the basement. I've never heard her myself, but..." She trailed off, her eyes darting toward the staircase. "But what?" I pressed. "There's a reason that phone doesn't work," she said quietly. "It hasn't been connected to a line in over 20 years. I left the shop in a daze, the woman's voice still echoing in my ears. I told myself I wouldn't go back, but some nights when I can't sleep, I find myself thinking about her, who she was, what happened to her, and why she's still trapped there, whispering for help." Story 10. I was 12 when I had the strangest and scariest experience of my life. It happened at my friend Jake's house, a place I'd visited countless times before. Jake's dad was a cop, a quiet and serious man who preferred to keep to himself. In all my visits, I'd only seen him a handful of times, always a distant, stoic presence in the background. Jake and I loved hanging out in the basement, where we had an old TV hooked up to a Nintendo. To the left of the gaming setup was the furnace room, a dimly lit, cluttered space where his dad kept his tools and equipment. It was the kind of room you avoided unless you absolutely had to go in. That afternoon, we were deep into a Mario Kart race when I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. I glanced toward the furnace room and froze. Standing at the workbench, partially shrouded in shadow, was Jake's dad. He was wearing a red flannel shirt and had his back to me, rummaging through a box of tools. I thought it was odd. Jake had mentioned earlier that his dad was working late. "Hey, Jake," I said, nudging him. "I thought your dad wasn't home." Jake looked up from the screen. "He's not? Why?" I gestured toward the furnace room, but the man was already turning to face me. Our eyes met, and he gave me the faintest grin, a strange, unsettling smile that sent a chill down my spine. Jake followed my gaze. "What are you talking about?" "There's no one there." I blinked and looked back. The room was empty. The tools on the bench were undisturbed, and the air felt colder somehow. We shrugged it off and kept playing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Later, when we went upstairs to grab snacks, I casually mentioned what I'd seen. Hey, your dad was in the furnace room earlier, wasn't he? I asked. Jake's mom, who was tidying up in the kitchen, stopped mid-motion. She turned to me, her face pale. What do you mean? She asked slowly. I saw him down there. He was wearing a red flannel, I said. He smiled at me. Jake's mom dropped the dish she was holding. It shattered on the floor, but she didn't seem to notice. Jake stood there, frozen, his face a mixture of confusion and fear. My dad's at work, Jake said quietly. He's not here. The room fell silent. Jake's mom exchanged a nervous glance with him before she knelt to pick up the broken pieces of the plate. Are you sure it was him? She asked, her voice trembling. Of course it was. I said, I think it was. Who else could it be? She didn't answer. Instead, she stood up abruptly and said, Jake, why don't you take your friend outside for a bit? Mom, what's going on? Jake asked. He looked as shaken as I felt. Just do it, Jake, she snapped, her voice sharper than I'd ever heard it. We went outside and sat on the porch in awkward silence. After a while, Jake finally spoke. You saw someone in the furnace room. Yeah, I said, my voice quieter now. It looked like your dad, but I don't know. Something about him felt off. Jake didn't say anything for a long time. Finally, he muttered, I think my mom knows something. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the man in the furnace room. His smile replayed in my mind, the way it seemed almost too perfect, too deliberate. I didn't sleep well, and the next time I went to Jake's house, I couldn't bring myself to go back into the basement. Years later, I asked Jake about it. We were in high school by then, and we'd mostly drifted apart, but curiosity got the better of me. Hey, remember that time at your house? When I saw someone in the furnace room, I asked casually. Jake went pale. Yeah, I remember. What was that about? Did your mom ever say anything? Jake hesitated, glancing around as if someone might overhear. She wouldn't tell me much, but I think she knew it wasn't my dad. What do you mean? I pressed. He took a deep breath. After that day, my mom had the furnace room locked up. She never let me go in there again. And she started talking about the man who built our house. What about him? Jake looked at me, his expression grim. He died down there, in the furnace room. To this day, I don't know who or what I saw in that basement. But sometimes late at night, I think about that grin, and I wonder if the man in the red flannel is still there, waiting.